Hello, my name is Monica Reida, and my favorite thing is coffee.
Welcome to the Finding Favorites podcast, where we explore your favorite things without using an algorithm. Here's your host, Leah Jones.
Hello and welcome to Finding Favorites. I'm your host, Leah Jones, and this is the podcast where we learn about people's favorite things and get recommendations without using an algorithm. This week, my guest has the episode that has influenced the most people of any episode of Finding Favorites. She is a writer and artist living on Chicago's West Side, and her writing has appeared in the book, The Midwest Architecture Journeys, and in outlets including Barista Magazine, All Milwaukee, Milwaukee Record, and our beloved Gaper's Block, where she was the politics editor from 2013 to 2015. You can find her online and follow all of her new comics creations, which I have been enjoying on Instagram. My guest this week, Monica Reida. Monica, how are you?
I'm doing great, Leah, and I love that we both kind of have themed. This episode, I feel like, has been kind of a long time coming because before we did that influential episode, I kind of had brainstormed and I had suggested doing coffee, but I felt like coffee was the most basic possible thing because of the whole the first coffee and all of that. And so I was like, well, we'll talk about Murdoch mysteries.
Yes. Oh, my mom has watched all 15 seasons. My upstairs neighbor Ezra has watched all of it. I have watched a lot while recovering from various surgeries. So my memory of Murdoch mysteries isn't great, but it's it defines cozy mystery. And
they just did a musical episode and it's entirely sung. They choreographed it.
Okay.
I think this is me doing a plug for Murdoch Mysteries for anyone who listens to the podcast who maybe has fallen off a bit. If you love musicals, I feel like there's a big overlap in the listenership.
Yeah.
We just did a musical episode called Why Is Everyone Singing?
Amazing. So I do remember when you were like, we could talk about affogatos, which is espresso with ice cream, espresso drip made on top of vanilla ice cream. But right, you went with Murdoch Mysteries and it was a great conversation. What are other things before we get into coffee? What are some of the other things in the last few years that have caught your eyes?
There's been, I've really kind of honed my home barista skills. There is, in fact, an entire countertop in my kitchen that is just a coffee brewing station.
Wow.
So I have been getting very excited about coffee from roasters all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
We can definitely get into decaf and how there are some coffee roasters that are doing some really exciting things with decaf coffee. And I actually think decaf unfairly gets a lot of kind of a bad rep, I think, from people because there's the whole death before decaf kind of, that cliche. There's some exciting stuff going on with decaf. I can definitely get into the whole, the wild world of barista competitions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I know about having written for Barista Magazine. There's a lot that I can get into. I could really get into the weeds here. And we can just also start with kind of my coffee origin story, because I was initially not a coffee person. And it's interesting because when I was I think we need to do this, I remember listening to an episode you did with our mutual friend, Terry Gant, who a couple of weeks ago I did make coffee for.
Nice.
He came over to my house and I made coffee for Terry.
I love it.
But Terry was talking about affogatos, and I think you said, you were like, Monica knows more about coffee than I will ever know in my life. So there was that. And then I had coffee a couple of weeks ago with another recent guest of the podcast, Scott Smith. And we were talking, and I started talking about how someone got disqualified for using oat milk in barista competitions because it's not actually a dairy milk. And Scott was like, but see, that's actually interesting. That's an interesting thing you bring to this conversation. And so I was like, okay, I'm messaging Leah.
Yes.
We can talk about coffee.
Oh, absolutely.
I feel very pretentious when I say it, but when I think about people who are like, oh, I love coffee. I'm like, no, you merely like coffee. I love coffee.
Right. And I would say I'm, due to some of the medications I've been on post-cancer, kind of started losing my taste. Like, I don't drink hot coffee hardly ever anymore, which is a bummer because I love the ritual of like a hot coffee in the morning. I love making a, now I am like, I grew up in a Folgers house where we had a teapot, we had a coffee pot that the water boiled in. We had a specific strainer. We used paper towels. We put the coffee in the strainer and put the boiling water into the coffee pot, and that stayed warm on the oven all day. And then like in college, I got a plug-in coffee maker. And in my home life, never moved beyond that. I feel like maybe I had a French press for a week and immediately shattered it, and was for one summer in college a barista, but of like a kiosk that I literally had to haul the water to and haul my waste away from to the 7-Eleven. So I have coffee almost every day, but I have switched now to iced coffees. So I do not have, I don't have a sophisticated palate for coffee, even though I've been drinking it since I was like 16.
Okay.
So you said you weren't originally a coffee person. So what is your coffee origin story?
Well, so growing up in Iowa, there was this really awesome coffee shop in our downtown area, Cup of Joe. And like all of the tables and chairs were like old, vintage, like 1950s.
Mismatched.
Yes, and like they had like mannequins like in old vintage clothes, like up, but like on ledges. And that's where I would go to get, I'd go to like do like work on my homework after school. And I do remember getting like mochas there because they would put like just like all of the whipped cream and like chocolate sauce on top.
Yes. Ours was called Coffee Grounds, the exact same mix of vintage tables. George was the owner. He was so handsome. He was eventually caught embezzling money from the coffee shop and lost it. But he's who I worked for. And that is where I discovered the Chunky Monkey Mocha, which was an iced coffee with banana flavoring and whipped cream to taste like Chunky Monkey ice cream. But yes.
That actually sounds really tasty.
Oh, it's good. It's real good.
But I just, for some reason, I couldn't get into coffee.
Sure.
And I remember even in college when I was at, I don't think I ever really drank coffee when I was at DePaul. For those amazing 6 months I was a student at DePaul. When I was a student at UIC, I lived in Uptown, and I remember I would go to the original Dollop, which is very different from how Dollop is now. In fact, I actually get like really jaded about Dollop because the original Dollop at Clarendon and Buena, like all of the tables like had like old paperbacks underneath the legs to stabilize the legs. And there's like one like down in the loop that it's like all glass and shiny. And I'm like, what is this?
Right.
But I would get like a latte. So it'd be like, oh, I'm going to meet someone at a coffee shop. I should get a latte. But I never was like a coffee person. And then when I finished up my education at Michigan State, I do have memories of, for listeners or anyone who has gone to down to Urbana-Champaign, they're probably familiar with Espresso Royale.
Okay.
And there was a location across from Michigan State's campus. And I have a lot of memories of working on homework and working on papers and doing readings and drinking dirty chais, which are chai lattes with a shot of espresso in them.
Okay.
But again, I never was a coffee person.
Right.
But then I moved to Milwaukee for family reasons. And my sister is like, hey, let's get you into coffee. And my sister
was your sister into coffee and wanted a coffee buddy? Or she was like,
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. And so, but my sister does it very methodically.
Okay.
So my sister's like, let's start off with a mocha. And then once I'm kind of like very comfortable with mochas, my sister's like, okay, now let's do a latte. And then once I'm comfortable enough with lattes, then my sister's like, what are you noticing? Like, what textures are you getting? You know, what flavor notes are you getting with this? And then my sister was like, okay, then we're going to move to like a cortado. I still remember where I had my first cortado. It was at the Collectivo Coffee in Bayview at Kinnickinnick and Lincoln. in
Okay.
Milwaukee. So my sister does this all very methodically. But my sister also then, when we get to espresso, and my sister, like, we have a running joke in my family, had a running joke in my family that I would sometimes make coffee face. And if something is particularly bad, I will just like have this involuntary like facial reaction where like I can't hide that this is
Yeah.
disgusting.
I bet it's similar to persimmon face. If you've ever had an
Probably.
unripe persimmon, it just gets you in the back and you can't control what happens with your face. So I imagine
Yeah.
similar. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually remember when I was in Montreal on vacation, I walked into the flagship Hudson's Bay in downtown Montreal, and they had samples of, it was like pumpkin spice Nespresso.
Okay.
And I was like, oh, messy. And I have a sip of it, and it is absolutely disgusting. And I'm just glad I'm like walking away from the salesperson so they don't seem going. But so I start making like these like disgusted, like, oh God, this is so bitter. This is miserable. And my sister's just like, you don't have to have espresso shots. If espresso is just like too intense for you, you can just stick with black coffee.
Right.
And so my sister kind of understands this. And this is a little different from my mother. When my mother, like ladies in her book club, my mom was like, I'm going to get them into coffee. And my mom went straight to espresso. And my sister was like, no, what are you doing?
Right. It's a slow, there can be a slow on ramp.
Yes. And when I was living in Milwaukee, I was working in marketing, and it's been completely renovated, but the company that I worked for was next to a mall. And in that mall, one of the coffee roasters, Stone Creek Coffee, had a little kiosk. And so a lot of us for our morning coffee would go to that kiosk and get our coffee. And the more I was there, the more I was like, eventually I got my own apartment, and I was like, hey, maybe I can start learning how to brew my own coffee. And so then eventually, because I worked a lot in marketing and I became comfortable with housewares, eventually I do go and buy my own French press. And I still have it. It is a red Bodum French press from their Brazil line. Because I also was like, well, anyone can have like any plain French press, but I'm like, I'm going to be fun. I'm going to be colorful. And at the time, I had like cabinets in my kitchen that had like glass paneling. So I was like, you can see what's in my cabinets. I want you to see that I've got this like beautiful red French press. And then that year, my sister and I both get each other as gifts an AeroPress. So then it's like,
yeah.
And it's very cool because, like, I think at that time the AeroPress had like very distinct packaging for how it was sold, and it like I think it was a hexagonal box.
Okay.
And those just become my regular coffee brewing tools.
So I know that a French press, you put the grounds in the bottom, you add the hot water, and then after it brews, you press essentially a mesh filter over it so that you can pour. What is an AeroPress's like basic function?
So, and coincidentally, I am wearing my AeroPress shirt.
Nice. Oh, that cat is so cute.
So an AeroPress, it's a plastic coffee brewer. So there are two different ways you can brew it. And there's actually like an AeroPress competition.
Okay.
And so people will come up with all different variations on how to brew with the AeroPress. But the two basic ways you brew it, one is you have a little like kind of plastic filter that has a bunch of holes in it. You put a paper filter in there. You kind of wet the filter. And then you put the coffee grounds, and then you attach it to kind of this like plastic cylinder. And then you put the coffee grounds in, wet the coffee grounds, let it kind of release some of the carbon dioxide. And then you add it, create a bit of a vacuum, let it rest for a bit, stir it a little bit more, and then you push all the liquid out through the bottom, and then you've got a cup of coffee.
Okay.
And it takes like 1 minute and 15 seconds to brew.
All right.
It is super quick, super easy. And the great thing, a lot of people will actually recommend an AeroPress for like camping and traveling because it's plastic. It's virtually indestructible.
Right.
Some people also, they'll do an inverted method. I'm not a big fan of inverted methods. In fact, every time I go to do it, I then like have to pull up videos on YouTube to refresh my memory. But then also I'll like do it so then when you do push down, there's like it has like a plastic, like a rubber plunger on another part. And so you put like the rubber plunger in first, and then you like put the like cylinder part, then you put the coffee in, you fill it up with water, stir it a little bit, let it rest. Then you put like the paper filter and the kind of the bottom part of it that has the holes in the bottom. You attach it and then you flip it up. And I always end up getting coffee everywhere, no matter like how smooth and seamless I try to make it. So I'm just like, I'm just going to brew it into like a carafe or my cup and just do it that way.
Okay. So you start with a French press, then you
start with the AeroPress.
Right. So this is how you're getting into home coffee.
Yes. And that does work very well. I love my AeroPress. In fact, I love my AeroPress so much. The AeroPress logo has been completely washed off of my AeroPress. That is how much I love my AeroPress. And then eventually I buy a couple other things. I worked for a hot second at Starbucks. And eventually I buy a very weird pour over thing I have at Starbucks that does use standard coffee filters.
Oh, that's
and
nice.
by standard, I mean like, I mean
like the
they're
flat
like
bottom.
Flat bottom, number 4. Like you can easily find these in the coffee aisle anywhere. But at that time, the grinder I'm using, because a big thing people tell you when you're brewing coffee at home is grinding your coffee beans fresh every day is key, because once you grind it, the coffee beans begin oxidizing. And once that begins, that changes the flavor profile of a coffee bean. So grinding the coffee beans fresh every morning is key. So I'm grinding it and I'm using this like cheap little coffee grinder that I have. The other thing is I was just kind of eyeballing and being like, hey, I think this is enough beans. Except my sister, who by this point has been working as a barista, my sister has been managing cafes, my sister has like gone to Colombia and has like met with coffee farmers and baristas over there. My sister finds out that I am just eyeballing, and I get a text one day that says, you have a scale coming from Amazon. So to this day, I have a bright orange Ascali scale. It is kind of like the standard scale for measuring coffee beans or just anything in your kitchen. And that is the scale that I use every morning when I measure my coffee beans, when I'm measuring the water that I use, because when you are brewing coffee, the ideal thing you want to use is like a good like water to coffee ratio. Now we're getting into like water to coffee ratios. Instead, I was just like kind of like throwing caution to the wind. And then once I go off to law, like once I'm starting to like get ready for law school, that's when I start to get really into it. And that's also when I become the affogato person. And the affogato thing kind of starts off as an accident, because I purchase an attachment for my AeroPress. And it is called the Fellow Prismo. Fellow is a big player in the coffee industry. They make a lot of cool coffee gadgets.
So this is an AeroPress Fellow collab.
It's actually not officially with AeroPress. They're just like, this is something we've designed on our own. You can add this to your AeroPress. Coincidentally, AeroPress has now released something that looks a lot similar to the Prismo. And those of us who have Prismo attachments, it's not lost on us that this is very similar to the Prismo attachment. And because I love my AeroPress, I'm like, well, this is like the next logical thing to get.
Is this an attachment that lets you take it from drip coffee to espresso shots?
Yes.
Okay.
Even though there are some people who will probably tell you, like, it's not actually espresso, but I'm like,
Sure.
it's espresso-esque.
A more concentrated way to brew finely ground beans.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's when I start making affogatos.
Mmm.
And I'm going, this is really delicious. And I show up at the dean, and at the law school I was attending, they have for incoming law students this dean's welcome barbecue. And it was a thing I didn't particularly want to go to. I was in mourning at the time, but I was like, I need to show up.
Yeah.
And I barely remember going to this thing, but I do remember I'm there and people were talking about great cold brew.
Mm-hmm.
And I say, oh, cold brew is so passe. You need to get on the affogato bandwagon.
Uh-huh.
And I think everyone was like, what's an affogato? And I explained what an affogato is. And that is kind of the beginning of me being the affogato person. And I'm just kind of doing it to kind of like be weird, be contrarian, and also just like try to do something to make myself feel good because I wasn't feeling too hot at that
Right.
moment. And it's very funny because, and we can dig more into affogatos eventually, but then like now I feel like affogatos are everywhere.
Right.
So that's the beginning of me being like the affogato person.
Okay.
But also then I get my own place again for law school because I'd been living with family. And I get a V60, which is kind of another big kind of standard coffee brewer. And that is made in Japan. It is very conical.
Okay.
It has a very interesting, very conical filter, and you only fold it on one side. It is very beautiful. They also have filters that look like origami lovebirds because,
Mm-hmm.
of course, they do.
These are so pretty.
They're gorgeous.
So essentially the show notes of this are going to be like Monica cutter instead of wire cutter, like your approved coffee stuff. But these, I just went on the Hario site of the V60 drippers, and they are like, they're just plastic $14 jobbers, but they're so pretty. Like they are so aesthetically, ooh, this copper one that is not $14. They're beautiful.
Well, and the one that I ended up getting, I got kind of like a starter kit from Williams Sonoma.
Mm-hmm.
And so it comes with a glass carafe. It comes with a ceramic V60. It comes with the filters. It comes with, I've long since broken the little stopper for the carafe. So it's this great set. And because I was moving into a new apartment, I was like, this is like my treat to myself.
Yeah.
I get a really good grinder at this point, which this is going to also be like the Monica cutter. The OXO has a burr grinder that when one of my cousins got married, that was, my mother found out that my cousin asked for a Chemex and didn't have a grinder. And immediately my mom hopped on Amazon.
Uh-huh.
And that was like, most people were like, oh, I'm getting this grinder. And it's like, no. Like for, I think like the OXO grinder is like, last I knew, like $100. And like, that is like a good starter grinder. And
Yeah.
it's it's easily like one of my favorite things I have. But then going back to Fellow has the Stag EKG, which it has a weighted handle. It is a gooseneck kettle. And a lot of people tell you that the gooseneck kettle is great for a good consistent pour, especially when you're making a V60, because you can have good concentric circles as you are pouring water.
Okay.
And my sister immediately is like, you don't need a Stag EKG. That's too expensive. Why are you getting a Stag EKG? But I'm also a tea person. And when I was in college, I was more of a tea person. I think part of it was I also was spending way too much time around someone who was a tea person.
Sure.
Imagine someone who's the most pretentious person you can think of with tea. This person was more pretentious than that. Teavana was too like low quality for this person.
Sure.
And this was before Teavana got bought out by Starbucks. So like that's how pretentious this person was about their tea. Like they only wanted Lapsang Souchong. So
yeah, me too. I definitely know what that is and care about it a lot.
So, well, and actually when I was in prepping to take the LSATs,
Yeah.
I worked for a tea store. And so I was like, I do care about my tea. I do love tea.
Yep.
So having a kettle that I can set to a precise temperature is something I want.
Yeah. I studied abroad in Argentina
Ooh.
and learned how to make mate while I was there.
Oh,
And between Argentina and being a barista for a summer, learning what different temperatures sounded like, of knowing what the kettle sounds like just before a boil, and like that's the right temperature for mate, or knowing like when you're steaming milk. I never used the thermometer because you would listen and it would sound a particular way when it was the right temperature. So I do understand. I was joking, but I do understand wanting, if you can have something that tells you it's at 160, it's at 155, it's at 2, whatever the temperature is, so that you don't scald the tea leaves.
yeah.
Like I totally get that. But I learned those skills in the 90s before thermometers existed, frankly.
Well, and and so for me, I was like, if this is the thing I'm splurging on is a
Yeah,
great kettle, I'm going to do it. So that's when I really dig into it. And then, of course, that's 2019. Then we go into lockdown.
right.
And then all of a sudden on Instagram and Facebook and my texts, people are blowing me up my texts and my Instagram messages and asking me, hey, how do I make coffee at home?
Right.
Like, what are some good things? And I've kind of like, as time has progressed, like, I kind of had like good, simple tools, but I've kind of like built on them. I now have a maca pot that is a traditional Italian. Again, most people would say it's not actually espresso, but Italians will tell you it's an espresso maker.
Right. Is that the silver one that's hourglass shaped?
Yes.
Okay.
When I lived in Brooklyn, I had an 83-year-old Italian landlady
Mm-hmm.
who would make espresso in a maca pot on
Nice.
her stove. And this was before I found out I had celiac disease, but I have good memories of that. Put a little bit of sugar in it, have like some rainbow cookies, and
Mm-hmm.
you like it.
Yeah. So what I think is interesting, of all these tools you're talking about, these are all countertop or stovetop tools. I haven't yet heard you say, and then I got a steamer, or then I got like an espresso machine.
I haven't gotten to, I mean, I have entered to win a Linnea home, but I
Sure.
haven't gotten to that point yet.
Okay. I think it's I think most people don't know that you can do espresso or espresso adjacent shots without an espresso maker. Like that to me is news. Like I didn't know that there were tools you could use other than buying the big countertop espresso machine.
Well, and it's interesting because, like, when you learn about the history of the maca pot, the big reason why that was invented was because it was a way of making espresso affordable and accessible for Italians
Mhm.
so that they could just have it in their homes whenever they wanted. And so, again, even though some people would say, like, it's not actually espresso, but, like, I mean, that's the entire reason why it was invented in Italy. And you think about the fact that espresso in cafes are a way of life in Italy.
Right.
And then similarly, when you think about, the fact that you can have a Prismo attachment, and if you've got an AeroPress, you just pay $25. I think that's last I knew that was how much the Prismo attachment costs. And just, attach it, and then you've got a great shot of, what's effectively espresso. And that was perfect for me for a long time if I wanted to make an affogato. And it's I'm never going to tell someone like, you shouldn't get an espresso machine. Like if you want to take that step,
Right.
go ahead. But then even for someone like me, I'm like, okay, if I do that, I'm going to like really commit to it. And I name dropped the Linnea Mini, which is made by La Marzocco, who makes like the standard. When you go into most coffee shops that aren't, Starbucks, you're going to see like a La Marzocco espresso machine. They're
Mhm.
designed in Florence. They are handcrafted in Italy. They are some of the most beautiful espresso machines in the world. And they make a home version of their flagship, the Linnea, and it's like $6,000.
Yeah.
That is how much it retails for. So anytime there is a giveaway for it, I'm like, yes, I do want one.
Right.
I would never pay $6,000 for it, but if you're giving it away, of course I'll want one.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I just looked it up. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful machine.
And it is just like a scaled down version of what you would see in a cafe.
Right. Yeah, because one of the things, I think for a while my parents might have had a little mini espresso maker. One of the things I have found hard when I wasn't like at the coffee kiosk I worked at in college is it's like 60 pounds of pressure that you have to tamp it down with.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something that I would push up on. Like the tamper wasn't something that I did with my hand. It was like you push the shot up onto the press, and the machine had to have weight to push back against you.
Yes.
And sometimes those little homemakers, like the home espresso machines, aren't heavy enough to give you the pressure you need to actually tamp the grounds down. And that's the thing I've noticed is I'm like, oh, I can't, like, how am I supposed to like actually tamp these grounds down hard enough?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm very wary of a lot of home espresso makers.
Mm-hmm.
I may go have a little too much fun when I go to like Sur la Table or Williams Sonoma when I'm like actually like, I even like test to see like how well does the portafilter lock into place on this home espresso maker, because
Right.
it's a thing where I'm like, I kind of understand, even though the only espresso machine I've ever really used is a Starbucks one, which is like the most simple of espresso makers to use.
Right.
Because that's literally, you just push a button and it pours a shot.
Yeah.
So
I gotta say, these Stag EKG kettles are gorgeous. Listeners should click through these links because Monica is not suggesting a single ugly kitchen appliance. Everything is beautiful. Everything so far is like it would look nice on your counter if that matters to you. Like I don't need a new kettle right now. Mine does have temperature adjustments. It's fine, but it's not pretty. It was like I got it at Marshall's or TJ Maxx or something. It's functional, but it's not gorgeous. Like these EKG pour over gooseneck, they're beautiful.
and they also have a hidden, depending on which, I think each different model has a different game hidden in it. The one that I have is a play on Snake. For those of us who are old enough to remember, I think most of the listeners of this podcast remember Snake, the old game on, on our phones, like the old flip phones. It's called Wormy. And like once you toggle back and forth quickly enough, I think for the Celsius to Fahrenheit setting, because I worked for a Canadian tea company, I usually have my kettle set to Celsius because I'm weird. But they have a game and it's like a little worm and it's trying to eat all of the fellow logos and inside the little like monitor screen on it. So like they've put a lot of tech into it that they're also like, oh, by the way, here's this fun Easter egg. Like it's gorgeous, it's beautiful, it's functional. And then they're like, by the way, we put a little fun game in here too.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Amazing.
And the one I will probably end up sending you a photo of my coffee station. The one I have is just all black. But like if I one day am like, I want to get like the swappable, like dark wood handles because I can get those separately, I can do that.
Right.
It's and they've come like they have different like colors and all of that. It's and I will say the one thing I do not have in my coffee collection that I consistently eye is the origami pour over, which I believe the 2020 or maybe it was the 2019 World Barista Champion from South Korea used and won. It's absolutely gorgeous. It is like my dream coffee tool that I do not have. And in Chicago, there's a very fancy Starbucks, the Starbucks Reserve. And I saw it there last time I was there because you can get affogatos at the Starbucks Reserve.
Okay. I haven't been there. It's like it took over the Crate and Barrel. And it's like a 4-story
Yes.
Starbucks.
It's where I go after every time I have a doctor's appointment at Northwestern,
Mm-hmm.
especially after, like, they do a terrible job of wayfinding, which happened most recently.
It's the worst.
I
I have been yelling about this on my Twitter and my Instagram ever since I got diagnosed with cancer. On my chart, they give you the street address, and the building, they give you the building name, and never the two shall meet. It's like, good fucking luck.
am so it's most of my doctors are with University of Chicago, and I'm very glad that University of Chicago is very clear. Like, they're like, this doctor is in this building on this floor. Like, they have it almost like down to the precise, like almost to like the precise room at University of Chicago Medicine. And like, I had to go get blood work done at 8 a.m. on a Saturday at Northwestern, and
Oh,
like,
good luck.
and it was a thing where I was like, this is the famous terrible wayfinding that Leah has kvetched about.
Yes. Yeah. Oh boy. It gets me riled up. I haven't even been there in weeks. And you mentioned it. And I have a degree in health communications from Northwestern. I was never able to get a job in health communications with that degree. And I'm like, Northwestern, hire me for 1 week. Just 1 week. Let me work with your Epic team on my chart. I understand that that changing all the signs in the buildings is expensive, but we can change it on my chart. And I feel like I saw the change once in January, and I was like so happy and posted about it everywhere. And now I feel like it was a blip. It was one little blip, and it was not in fact fixed.
But yeah, so anytime I have a doctor's appointment at Northwestern, I think it's largely because like most of my doctors are down at University of Chicago. So it's like,
yeah,
well, I went to Northwestern for like this one doctor's appointment. Hey, I'm right by the Starbucks Reserve.
Yeah.
I'll go there. But anyway, last time I was there, I saw they had the origami pour overs, and I was like, oh, the origami pour overs. And I'm like, you have enough coffee toys, Monica. But they're so gorgeous.
These are beautiful.
Every glaze they have, and even like the wooden holder for them is beautiful. It's, again, there are so many of these coffee things. Like, the AeroPress, I think, is maybe like the most functional.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the most like the least like beautiful of all of these things I have mentioned. And even still, like, I still love my AeroPress. I have plans to eventually get a tattoo of an AeroPress because of how much I love my AeroPress.
Mm-hmm.
But like, it's very interesting because once you enter the world of pour overs, there are so many. It's very interesting because I feel like the world of coffee and coffee gadgets is very much a world of form and function meeting.
So we have talked about your origin story and your current, how you've built up the tools in your kitchen, how you became the affogato person. But yes, what is it? What do we need to know about affogatos? It's espresso and ice cream, right?
I mean, that's it. It's espresso and ice cream. And I will say, it's hard to fuck up an affogato.
Yeah.
Like, I have had, I was in Austin, Texas once, and I went to, there's a really good vegan ice cream shop in Austin, Texas, Nadamu. And they had affogatos there. And I thought, great. And I had just like spent the afternoon out in one of the pools, and I was like, you know, it sounds great after spending the day in the Texas heat, you know, waddling around in a pool, an affogato. And the shot of espresso was really bitter. I could tell it wasn't dialed in. It was just not a great shot of espresso. But you put that shot of espresso in with even a vegan cookies and cream, and it's a good vegan cookies and cream ice cream, we'll say. And it's kind of like a really good, like, I think like the best way I can describe it is like a really great, like, cookies and cream frappuccino.
Okay.
So, like, even if you have like a bad shot of espresso, it's still a good beverage.
Right.
So it's kind of hard to mess up an affogato.
Yeah.
And again, I know some people will be like, well, an affogato is very basic. But the thing is, like, it's kind of a good people pleaser.
Yeah.
And it's, I'm very lucky. My neurologist has actually told me to drink more caffeine.
Great. Twist my arm.
Yeah, people are like, I actually walked into a cafe for one of the local roasters here in Chicago, Dark Matter, and the barista said, "Is this guy a lobbyist?" But I also was like, I appreciate that, like, I'm the person who loves coffee, and I found a doctor in my care team who's like, yeah, I think the way that we help take care of one of your issues is just drink more caffeine. So I was like,
Great.
so when I come home and I make an affogato at 6 p.m., he's like, yeah, do more of that. So it's a thing where, like, you can experiment with an affogato. You can, try different ice creams. Like, I love cookies and cream. That's a good one. I've had, like, a sea salt chocolate chip with that. I mean, you can't go wrong with vanilla.
Right.
I recently had at the Starbucks on Michigan Avenue a hot honey affogato.
Yeah. Yep.
And that
Was it
sounds
like vanilla ice cream with hot honey and espresso, or a hot honey ice cream?
It was espresso, and they use actually nitrogen infused gelato.
Okay.
Which is actually interesting because the nitrogen infused in that gelato, once the espresso hits it, it actually kind of keeps the gelato from melting quickly.
All right. Interesting.
But then they also put like a cocktail cherry on top too. So you had like the cocktail cherry, you kind of had like some of the juices from the cocktail cherry. You had the hot honey going on, and the specific like espresso that was used, all of those flavors coming together, it actually worked really well. It was like a very well crafted beverage.
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting because I'm now seeing affogatos at more and more places. There is a brilliant, wonderful coffee shop in Milwaukee called Discourse.
Okay.
I describe them as being both coffee artists and coffee mad scientists. I have had a cold brew there that was made with oat milk and root beer bitters. And it, honest to God, tasted like a root beer float, not cold brew.
Wow. Interesting.
And they had affogatos, and it was like a burnt sugar, pecan, walnut ice cream served with espresso. But then people also do like a matcha, like a shot of matcha poured over like a sorbet, and call that an affogato. If you're a fan of Jenny's ice cream, which I have mixed feelings about Jenny's, especially since Jenny's took over the old George's ice cream in Andersonville. But you can now get a cold brew affogato at Jenny's.
Okay.
And I will say, that's actually a really good affogato. Again, it's a thing where like the cold brew that Jenny's is using pairs really well with a lot of the ice creams that Jenny's uses.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to screw up an affogato. And it's one of those things where, like, if you already love like a frappe or a frappuccino, it's something that I feel like it's kind of easy to sell people on.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when I'm suggesting things to people, I'm like, if you liked X, you'll love Y.
Sure.
Like, that's how I feel about an affogato. It is interesting though, because now there are all of these like viral, like TikTok versions of affogatos. And I'll try recreating them in my own kitchen. And because I'm a coffee nerd and my partner is an engineer, I have figured out most of these. Editing is a hell of a tool.
Yes.
And so some of them I'm like, yeah, these have definitely been edited, because I will like do like everything they're showing, and like I will be like filming and I'd be like, no, that like it fails epically. And then it's interesting to kind of like hack through some of these viral TikTok affogatos. Because like the big way that they're doing now is like you spoon the ice cream in, but you like kind of have it like cover the entire interior, and then you like kind of carve a little hole out in the middle, and then you pour the espresso in that little hole. But the thing is that you sometimes will be like, and then you put it back in the freezer. That actually doesn't work.
No.
The basic law of thermodynamics, it will not work.
Right.
So it's been very interesting. And I know like even there are places that are like, affogato like floss and like it's so avocado has like become like a big trend, and it's very funny that as something that started off as me just making a joke at
Right.
an event in law school in 2019, it's finally caught on. And I'm not going to be someone who's going to be like, well, I liked avocados before it was cool. I'm just happy everybody is on the avocado bandwagon.
Yeah.
I'm kind of also glad because I got a little sick of cold brew being everywhere, even though I do have a lot of feelings about cold brew.
Mm-hmm. So we got a little bit of a late start this morning because around 11:30, we were set to start at noon. I was
Mhm.
like, I can't talk to Monica for an hour about coffee without coffee. So, of course, I immediately went to the car wash and then to Starbucks, which is one of my Sunday morning routines. And, I was like, well, now I'm going to Starbucks, which, like everybody says it's bitter or whatever. Like, I'm a Starbucks Dunkin' girly. And at Starbucks, I get their vanilla sweet cream cold brew. And
I
at Dunkin', I get a vanilla iced coffee because I trust Starbucks to actually have cold brew, whereas I don't. Sometimes Dunkin' will charge me for cold brew and serve me iced coffee, and they just won't admit they're out or they didn't make enough. Whereas Starbucks, if they are charging me for cold brew, it's actually cold brew. So I got the wire cutter cold brew system that they suggested. I think I made it once, and then I don't know how to use cold brew concentrate, and so I think I really did a number on myself and haven't used it since. I didn't water it back down.
I do have a cold brew maker. This will probably not surprise anyone.
Right.
It's a very small cold brew maker because, again, when we were all in lockdown,
Yep.
although I lived in Wisconsin, so I don't think we were ever actually in lockdown. Thanks, Wisconsin. So what I would do is I would actually make like cold brew kind of lattes. And so I actually like did do a good ratio of cold brew concentrate. So I would make a concentrate, and what the cold brew maker I have, it kind of like goes like straight into a carafe, and I put like a little stopper in it, put it in the
Mm-hmm.
fridge. And then I would kind of like do like one part cold brew concentrate and then two parts. Usually I would do like oat milk
Yeah.
or like a lactose free milk. I also found I was doing cold brew tonics,
Yep.
but I
With
found
like a Topo Chico or something.
no, I actually was using tonic water.
Oh, nice. Interesting.
Um
Okay. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
the tricky thing was I had to be very specific about what beans I was using with that, because there were some beans I was using and it just tasted terrible with the tonic water and the
Mm-hmm.
lime wedges. But the icebreaker blend from Wonder State in southwestern Wisconsin, which is their specially formulated blend for a cold brew concentrate,
Mm-hmm.
is consistently one that makes a very versatile cold brew concentrate. And so I don't really, and so it is very funny because, again, I like, the whole affogato thing kind of started off as a joke and me being like, cold brew so passe.
Yeah.
I've also kind of gotten into a lot of canned coffees. There are some really great canned coffees,
Mm-hmm.
particularly from Asia.
Yeah.
Boss Coffee Flash Brewed Vanilla.
Okay.
If you go to, I didn't find it at H Mart the last time I was up at the Super H
Mm-hmm.
Mart next to King Spa, but I picked some up last time I was at another Asian supermarket. And that is like one of the smoothest, creamiest canned coffees on the market.
I'll say I went to Japan for work the week I turned 26.
Hmm.
So 20 years ago, 21 years ago. And in Tokyo, the vending machines with canned coffee, it was like living in the future. It was so I was like, how does this exist and we don't have it? Because they were so good. They were such high quality, cold and hot coffees. You could get a hot coffee in a can just like on not any street corner, but like any vending machine. It was fascinating.
One of my favorite video game series, the Yakuza Like a Dragon video game
Mm-hmm.
series, is set in Japan, and I do like picking up like a can of Boss coffee at the grocery store and being like, "This will restore 20 mana points." Because you can go in some of the games to the vending machines and get like a can of Boss coffee, Rainbow
Nice.
Blend, and keep it in your inventory. And then, you need to restore some mana points so you can do a special attack. And,
I love it. Yeah, when you mentioned the cold brew tonic, the reason I said Topo Chico is the day I finished Radiation, Ronnie and I had dinner at the Machine on Division, which is a restaurant with a florist. It's great. There's a florist with a little cart of flowers that goes table to table, and you can make your own bouquet. And I had like one drink, and then I was like, I need something caffeinated, but I don't want Coke. I don't really want coffee. I was like, I told the bartender, I'm like, I don't really know what I'm asking for, but is there something caffeinated that's not just a can of Coke? And he was like, yeah, I've got you. And it was espresso over ice with Topo Chico and like a orange peel.
Oh, that sounds fabulous.
It was amazing. And he gave me like the bottle of Topo Chico so I could manage like the mixture myself. And I've only had it once or twice, but it was like a revelation in what a caffeinated drink at a bar could be, or even it was so refreshing. And I was just like, I could see this, how amazing this would be like on an Italian summer day to have espresso with like a nice seltzer and a little citrus garnish.
Well, and the first time I had an espresso tonic, I was in Kansas City for my cousin's wedding. Same cousin that my mother bought an OXO grinder for.
Yeah.
And it was 100, the real feel was like 109 degrees, like 98% humidity. My hair was huge.
Mm-hmm.
I used all of the setting spray for my makeup for this
Yep.
wedding. And it was this thing where it was just this heat, this oppressive humidity, and I needed some good coffee. And so we went to a coffee shop in Kansas City called Monarch, which has now closed, which makes me very sad. It was an absolutely gorgeous kind of like, felt very European in terms of how its feel was. And I had an espresso tonic, and they gave us metal straws. They almost looked like brass.
Mm-hmm.
And so sipping that espresso tonic, and I think they put mint leaves in there too.
Oh, yeah.
And sipping it through, it was just the most refreshing thing with that brutal, oppressive heat and humidity. Except then the next day, my mom and I went back and got another espresso tonic right before my cousin's wedding. And there were multiple factors. And I felt like really anxious and nauseous. And I'm like, is it because my cousin's getting married? Is it because I just had a shot of espresso?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, what's going on? Is it because I'm in a church right now?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm the only Jewish person here?
Right.
I don't know what's going on. Like
Can't feel my arms. I can't feel my legs. Is it the espresso or is it like, waiting for God to strike me down?
Is it because I'm waiting for people to like turn and like look at me weirdly because it was a mess. So the other lesson to take away from this is, hey kids, do not drink espresso before going to a wedding.
Right. Also because sometimes espresso can do other work on your body that needs you need to be in close proximity to a restroom.
Yes.
And not in many layers of formal clothing.
I did dress a little light though. Thanks, Coles.
Yeah.
That was also a thing where I was like, hey, I'm going to my cousin's wedding and I feel like I'm going to not spend $100 on a dress.
Yeah.
So it's been an interesting journey with coffee, and it's very interesting because like I have become like that coffee friend you have. And at that same time, people will sometimes call me a coffee snob. But the flip side is like, I will get Starbucks in a pinch.
Yeah.
I love actually when it gets to be autumn, and I know it's not pumpkin spice latte I get excited about. It's Starbucks nitro cold brew with the pumpkin sweet foam. That pumpkin sweet foam goes great with the nitro cold brew. It is a great flavor pairing. And I get unapologetically excited about that. I'm not like my mother and sister. I one time went to Intelligentsia. This was before I moved back here to Chicago. And I was like, hey, I'm at Intelligentsia. And my sister texted, what are you doing at Intelligentsia? And I'm like, what's wrong with me going to Intelligentsia?
They're a local coffee chain. Why wouldn't you go there?
Right. And also it was like right off. I went to one in Logan Square. So it was like, it was right off the Kennedy. Like that was really easy for me to get to.
Yeah. I mean, the only reason I would skip Intelligentsia, and this was years ago before my ADHD was diagnosed, and I would drink 2 venti coffees a day at least, minimum. So that may also be why I drink less coffee now, is that I sometimes remember to medicate my ADHD, and so I don't need to self-medicate with coffee as much. And then Intelligentsia, this was like in maybe 2008, 2009, they announced they would no longer serve large hot coffees because they didn't believe your experience as a drinker would like that by the time you got to the end of the cup, it would be too cold to enjoy. And so they were no longer going to sell a large coffee. And I was like, you know what? Fuck you. Fuck you. I'm going to Dunkin'. I'm going to Starbucks. They will let me decide how much coffee I get. I was so offended by that.
This is also funny because Friday I was in Pilsen and I went to Cafecito Jumping Bean.
Uh-huh.
And I got a medium cafe con leche.
Okay, yep.
And it was an absolutely wonderful cafe con leche. I actually like let out like a really happy sound and I kind of like got weak in the knees from how good this cafe con leche was.
Nice.
But I was also noticing I got a medium and their medium was most coffee shops large.
Oh, wow.
Which I'm okay with. I think I spent like, it was like $2.75 for cafe con leche. It was not
$2.75?
Yes.
For a coffee in 2024 of any sort? That's amazing.
I think it was like the least amount of money I've spent on a cup of coffee in a long time.
Yeah.
And it was like one of the best cups of coffee I've had in a long time. But I also was like, this is what most coffee shops would consider to be either large or they're extra large.
Right.
And I'm like, and this is also like the best cup of coffee I've had in a long time. But I could see also like, especially, I do also know for a fact that at least when Starbucks launched their Nitro Cold Brew, you cannot get the Nitro Cold Brew larger than a grande.
Yeah.
And it's because the nitrogen increases the concentration of the caffeine.
Right.
So basically, Starbucks as like they're basically doing the inverse of Panera.
Their compliance department won't allow them to take the risk of serving it, right?
Yeah, they're doing the opposite of Panera with their caffeinated lemonade.
Right.
So it's very, very interesting. It's also funny for me being back in Chicago because I'm now a coffee person. And now I'm like, the coffee scene has changed. It's expanded. Because now I think when I lived here initially, Metropolis and Intelligentsia would have been the places that would have been served everywhere.
Yeah.
And now I know, because I live on the west side and I live over by Oak Park, the Dali Bagel in Oak Park, which serves a lot of good kosher food. Which I'm not sure if they're kosher. They do. It's very Jewish deli style.
Yeah.
I know they have dark matter, and a lot of places, I feel like dark matter is like now stepping in where you would have had
Metropolis or Intelligent. Absolutely, yeah.
So it's now like I'm kind of like having to get my bearings a little bit as to like, okay, what are the coffee roasters here? Who are the coffee shops here? Like, what are like some of the coffee shops like in my area? So it's interesting for me. And then like at that same time, like when I do travel and like where I have lived, I can be like, oh, here are my go-to coffee shops in these cities. Like I can even like tell you like, where are my go-to coffee shops in Montreal? Where are my go-to coffee shops in Los Angeles?
Right.
And that feels a little weird to say like, oh, I have go-to coffee. Like sometimes if I'm missing, if I'm missing home in Los Angeles, I'll order coffee from certain coffee roasters.
Yeah.
Or if I'm missing like a friend that I had in New York, I will order coffee from roasters in New York.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting, like how coffee, like I have this relationship with coffee when I was not a coffee person before. And it's interesting how this has evolved. And like now I am the coffee person.
Right. So 2019 is Affogato year. So that's 5 years ago already. That's insane.
Yes.
How many years before that was your sister like, all right, we're gonna have a mocha?
That was 5 years prior to that.
Okay, so you're 10 years into being a coffee person.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. And if someone wanted to order some beans let's say someone has just gotten an AeroPress and they're like, all right, I'm going to use this AeroPress and just start making my basic morning cup of joe with it. Where would you tell somebody to start? What beans would they start with for like a morning coffee?
So I'm going to give my top 5 roasters.
Great.
So I'm a big fan of Go Get 'em Tiger in Los Angeles.
Okay.
Started by 2 US barista champions, and they've done a lot of great stuff. They actually donated coffee to WGA writers when they were on strike last year. So another good reason. So love their cafes, love their beans. I actually, as we have been recording this, I have been sipping a coffee from them that I currently have in my house right now. So they're one. I would recommend Stone Creek Coffee in Milwaukee, actually. And actually, Stone Creek has actually changed my mind about decaf. My partner likes the taste of coffee, but doesn't like how jittery he gets from coffee.
Uh-huh.
So we keep decaf in our house.
Sure.
And we currently have a Berry Colombia. Or is it a Guatemala? Anyway, we've got a berry from decaf coffee from them that when you add creamer to it, it legitimately tastes like berries and cream.
Wow.
It is amazing. And Stone Creek kind of changed my mind on it because, and we're recording this right before Passover starts, but one of their cafes is across from a grocery store that is like the place you go to in the Milwaukee area for kosher food.
Okay.
Like even all of the rabbis go there to shop for prepping for Passover. So when I would go there to pick up my matzah and other kosher for Passover food, I would go and be like, oh, I'm going to get my coffee beans as well, but it's 6:00 at night. I don't want to be up all night. Because they have a thing where if you buy coffee in their cafe, you get a free latte.
Yeah.
And so I would get a free latte, but I'd get a decaf shot. And they do some really exciting decaf coffee. I've gotten some really great blends from them. They consistently have some really great coffee. And usually I'm the type of person where I love a good light blend. I love a good single origin. But last summer, they had some medium blends, some medium roasts that were some blends. They had one that was called Block Party that I really, really loved. And they just opened a new cafe up in one of the suburbs of Milwaukee that was absolutely gorgeous. I put some photos of it on my Instagram, and I actually ended up going to that cafe twice while I was in Milwaukee because I was like, I love this space. I just want to go hang out in this space multiple times. So Stone Creek is another one. And also you can usually get 1 pound of beans from them. So in terms of price, it's usually like a good price you're going to get for your beans. I would recommend Joe Coffee in New York.
Okay.
They're a good standard coffee, one of my favorite roasters in New York. And again, they're a really good, solid coffee roaster. And also, when I'm missing coffee from New York, they're a place I go, and they've got a really top-notch espresso as well. That espresso with an oat milk over ice, one of my favorite things to beat the heat in New York. And New York summers are the absolute worst.
Disgusting.
They're the worst. They're disgusting, and it smells like hot garbage everywhere.
Yeah. Oh, and Joe Coffee has canned coffee.
Yes. I am a big fan of black and white roasters in, I believe, either Durham or Raleigh, North Carolina. Also started by US Barista Champions.
Okay.
They have some really wonderful coffee. I've never had a coffee from them. I was even like meh on, and just really, really wonderful coffee consistently. And I love getting coffee from them. And then I feel like I need to plug some Chicago roasters.
Let's do it.
So I'm going to do a tie, and no, instead of a tie, I'm going to give Big Shoulders here in Chicago.
Okay, yeah.
I think Big Shoulders just was named one of the best coffee roasters or best coffee shops by USA Today, even though I personally have beef with Gannett as someone who has a degree in journalism.
Mm-hmm.
But Big Shoulders, absolutely wonderful coffee all around. Again, they're another coffee roaster where I've never had a coffee from them I did not like. And just consistently, the coffee beans they select, the coffee beans they roast, they consistently knock it out of the park. And so Big Shoulders is another great roaster. So those are really good. Once someone kind of gets their bearings, they can kind of like start to explore a little bit more. And like I could go like really deep in the weeds and start to go with like, here are some international roasters. Like there's a South Korean roaster I absolutely adore.
Wow.
And there are loads of roasters. And I know that there are roasters here in Chicago. Like, I want to try Percolator. And not just because every time I think about them, I think of the Chicago house music classic Percolator. But, you know, there's so many different roasters. And, you know, once you start to like, you know, there are probably coffee roasters in people's backyards that, you know,
Right.
you can start to play around and eventually you can find out like, do you like this type of flavor? Do you like that type of flavor? I once sent someone I was dating when we went into lockdown. Because I knew she loved getting beans from Starbucks.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew it was going to be a little harder because of the restrictions in Toronto.
Yeah.
So I sent her some coffee beans from a roaster I really love in Toronto.
Yeah.
And she told me she really appreciated it. But then she was like, but I'm not a big fan of this flavor note. And then I was like, but you now know you don't like that flavor note.
Yeah.
And so once someone starts to get into it, you can kind of know what flavor notes you like. Like I personally love like fruity, jammy flavor notes.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes I kind of push myself out of there to be like, okay, like try a more chocolatey one, try a more caramel coffee.
Yeah.
But like otherwise, if left to my own devices, I would always go for like the really fruity, jammy type of coffees.
Mm-hmm. I just know that I feel like there's a coffee shop down the street from me where I feel like when I've gotten there, I tend to get lattes from them in part because I find their coffee really sour.
Mm.
And so I'll get a latte or I'll get something that'll lessen the sourness of it. So sometimes I'm like this like fancy coffee that is supposed to be elite coffee or high-end coffee or very expensive coffee. I often end up thinking it's sour, but my taste buds were blown out by chemotherapy and it really impacted my taste buds. So sometimes that's also kind of what has happened between me and coffee is it's not that I think coffee is like too bitter. I'm like, it's too sour. It's kind of like a sour beer almost. Like I've tried a sour beer and I'm like, who would ever choose this? It's not good.
It's like back when I was like could still drink. I technically couldn't drink beer. I just didn't know I wasn't supposed to. But like
before you knew you couldn't drink beer,
right? But I was like, I would have double IPAs, and I would be like, who is this for? Why would you like this?
Right.
I will also give a quick plug for Wen Coffee. It is a Vietnamese coffee startup. You can actually find their coffee at Whole Foods, and they have a website online. And they're working with Robusta. So if you, a lot of people in the coffee industry, they're very big on like, oh, well, we're using Arabica. And the problem is that there's been so much of a push to focus on farming and harvesting Arabica. But with climate change, that is actually making things a little more difficult. And so there have been a lot of huge conversations about sustainability in the coffee industry with climate change.
Right.
And so this is started by a first generation Vietnamese American woman. And she works with coffee farmers in Vietnam, I believe. And all of the coffee, I believe, or at least majority of the coffee is Robusta. And we had an anaerobic fermented Robusta from Vietnam. And it was, I feel like I just said a bunch of words and like even I can't explain like what it means, but it's like the fermentation process, it was like a weird, interesting fermentation process. And that does affect the flavor of the coffee. And it was unique. It was interesting. it was the type of coffee I've never had before.
Right.
And it is very, very, and so there are people who, particularly people of color, who are kind of confronting how do we decolonize coffee, because the coffee industry has been dominated for a long time by particularly white men.
Right.
How do we confront the fact that climate change is affecting the coffee industry?
Right. Where it grows, who can grow it.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I have had a canned coffee from that company that had condensed milk in it. And
Delicious.
it was amazing. So I recommend, if you are at the grocery store and you see their condensed milk canned coffee, worth a shot.
Nice. Is there anything? So we didn't even get into the barista competition. So we will have to revisit that.
I feel like that is like in the weeds in a way that I probably can't even explain.
But is there anything about your coffee journey, about home coffee brewing, about affogatos that we have not gotten into today that you would be sad if we hung up without mentioning?
I do also want to make a plug for a couple of things that I think are absolutely great resources for people who maybe would be starting off on their coffee journey. One is the YouTube channel for James Hoffman. So he won the World Barista Championship in 2007. Also, I do appreciate you saying barista, because as someone who is a long-time Welcome to Nightville listener, they always talked about the barista district, and a lot of Welcome to Nightville fans would get like really angry and hung up because they're like, why is Cecil mispronouncing barista? And then but that's actually how they pronounce it in like Europe. And so I'm like, well, but it's established in the canon of the show that Cecil is well traveled, so of course he's saying barista. So, side tangent that I actually think works on this podcast to be like,
great. Yeah.
So James Hoffman won the World Barista Championship in 2007, and he has a YouTube channel where he goes into the nitty gritty. Like, he gets very weird, very scientific about coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And he's also, he's reached 1 million subscribers, and he's kind of absolutely baffled that he has 1 million subscribers. He's like, I don't understand why 1 million people watch my channel.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something very lovely, very approachable, very funny about his channel. He's gotten into AeroPresses. He's gotten into maca pots. He has a French press method that is actually what I use when I brew a French press. And it actually makes a really nice, clean, smooth French press. I highly recommend his method. They actually profiled him in the New York Times, and they profiled him by way of a comic. It's a very delightful, lovely comic.
Mm-hmm.
So he has become kind of like a guy who I think is a great entry point. And I know people who don't care about coffee at all, but they love his channel.
Yeah.
So I really recommend his channel. It's also through his channel I found a coffee maker that I am completely obsessed with. It is the Makita coffee maker. It is a coffee maker designed for job sites.
Yeah, Makita's they make drills and stuff.
Yes, but it runs off of a battery for a drill.
Uh-huh.
And the power that it pulls almost the entire power off of a battery. It takes 7 minutes to brew a cup of coffee, and it's maybe 6 to 8 ounces. It's not even a lot of coffee.
Uh-huh.
It is the most ridiculous thing. I don't know why Makita made it. It is so ridiculous, and I am completely obsessed with this. In my day job, when I had an office, I wanted one of the drawings from the patent filing framed and hanging up in my office.
Yeah.
It is so bizarre. And his video for it is also very lovely, because he actually put on a fake mustache and went to an abandoned building to pretend he was at a job site to give a more immersive review of it.
Uh-huh.
So I really recommend James Hoffman's channel. It is very interesting, and sometimes he has takes that are not what you would expect. He ended up really loving the Ember mug, which is that mug that keeps your coffee warm,
right,
that's connected to your phone.
Yeah.
So I really recommend his channel. I also recommend the website Sprudge, whose shirt I am wearing. It is a shirt because this is a podcast, you can't see the shirt that I'm wearing, but it's a shirt that has a black and white tuxedo cat on it, and the cat is actually brewing an AeroPress and pushing down, brewing the cup of coffee into a coffee cup that says Sprudge on it.
Mm-hmm.
So Sprudge was started by Zachary Carlson and Jordan Michelman. And Jordan Michelman really does a lot of really great writing about the food industry in general.
Mm-hmm.
He actually just wrote a great piece, I think, for Eater about mineral water and how mineral water doesn't really get its due.
Huh.
But Sprudge is just Sprudge is a lot about more the coffee industry. But like, if you're traveling and you're like, hey, where are the best coffee shops in this city? Sprudge usually has great guides on like where those coffee shops are. Except I do take issues with their Milwaukee guide because they mention one coffee shop, Anodyne, and the location that they used is my arch nemesis because one time I ordered a cafe au lait, which is actually my usual order when I do go to a coffee shop.
Mm-hmm.
And it took like 15 minutes for them to make a cafe au lait.
Yeah.
At this particular Anodyne. And I was like, I'm going to be late for my professional responsibility class. And there was no one else in line. And like, since then, I'm like, the Anodyne at the public market, my arch nemesis. I like all of the other Anodynes, but not the one at the public market. It's all because of that one time it took them 15 minutes to make a drink that is drip coffee with some steamed milk.
Yeah.
But Sprudge is great. And then Zachary Carlson and Jordan Michelman have written 2 books, The New Rules of Coffee, which is also a great guide if you're getting into coffee. But they just also came out with a new book called But First Coffee. And the subtitle is A Guide to Brewing from the Kitchen to the Bar. I haven't actually read But First Coffee yet, but I can say The New Rules of Coffee is a really wonderful book. And I think they kind of like take a lot of the pretentiousness out. One of them even admits that like you could get like a really fancy coffee mug. And like one of them is like, I actually like have like a old mug from like Disneyland. And like, as we've been recording this, I've been using like a mug that I have from Disneyland myself.
Nice. Yeah.
That has the letter M and the Matterhorn on it. So like in our house, we have more mugs that are like more novelty mugs than like very fancy, pretentious mugs because you know, let's have fun with the mugs.
Yeah.
So those are the things I highly recommend. And depending on where you are, maybe they have classes. Stone Creek, for example, their whole thing is we're coffee geeks, never stop learning. So if you're in the Milwaukee area, I know Stone Creek Coffee has a lot of like learn to be a home barista, like learn brewing methods. Like you can even like learn how to do latte art and stuff like that. So depending on where you are, like some coffee shops have classes so you can like get into that stuff.
Outstanding. Monica, do you want people to find you on the internet?
Yes, for once.
For once.
So you can find me on the internet, really only on my Instagram at this point. I am on Instagram at Monica Reida, MonicaReida, where you can see my drawings and some of the works in progress I have been doing with the comics I have been developing, various kind of other drawings I do, photos of my cats and my gecko. You can see that. I'm not on Twitter anymore. Actually, it's funny. We recorded that Twitter episode, and then 3 weeks later, I got off of Twitter.
Right.
And then I'm not on any of the Twitter alternatives. Sorry, Zuck. I gave Threads a try. It wasn't engaging.
Yeah.
So it's really just on Instagram. Through my Instagram, I also have links to various websites. I probably should eventually create a link tree, but I have a portfolio website. I'm blogging again.
Outstanding.
I'm probably, after we get off of this call, I'm going to work on some character designs, and then I'm going to finally get around to writing about, hey, let's finally pay attention to women's sports.
Yeah. It's been an exciting couple weeks in women's sports with the women's NCAA Final Four and championship, and then the WNBA draft, which was a Met Gala level red carpet affair, took over my TikTok feed. I feel like Veronica is vindicated. People are paying attention for a moment, at least.
It's also been exciting because I was someone who, I feel like this is one of the gayest things I can admit on this podcast, but I went to a lot of women's basketball games in college.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also been exciting because, like, I went to the Red Stars home opener, and the Red Stars are the women's soccer team here in Chicago.
Yep.
And I believe they, like, had a record attendance at the home opener. And it's been very exciting. It feels like people are waking up and they're like, oh, women's sports are good.
Right.
And it's, like, I think seeing that, like, games for the Sky versus the Fever, like, those tickets are going in, like, over $1,000, I think I saw.
Yeah.
It's wild. And I think people are, like, waking up, and it's exciting. It's also been nice because my immigrant grandmother loves basketball. And there was one time she called me and we're just talking and catching up. And she said, so have you heard about this Caitlin Clark?
Amazing.
And I'm like, I can talk about women's basketball with my grandmother.
I love it.
It's exciting, like something I've loved for a long time, which is women's basketball. Like, now I can talk about it with, like, my 84-year-old immigrant grandmother.
Yeah.
Because she was like, oh, like, everyone is talking about this Caitlin Clark person.
Yeah.
So it's wonderful that, like, now women's sports have entered the mainstream, and I'm hoping, like, we start seeing female athletes getting paid equally. We start seeing, like, I hope we start seeing, like, those dominoes falling and we start seeing some more progress.
Yeah. I think it's going to be a really exciting, a new era of exciting, an exciting new era. Woo!
Yes.
Is starting.
Yes.
Awesome. We'll have you back to talk about it in the future. Finding favorites, please smash that subscribe button. Give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. On Good Pods, add us to your public playlists. I just figure if the reviews and subscriptions are helpful for big podcasts, they must be helpful for little independent podcasts too. Finding Favorites is edited and mixed by Rob Abrazado. And you can find me on Instagram, Finding Faves Pod, FindingFavsPod. Finding Faves Pod on Instagram, occasionally on Twitter, but really, I barely check it anymore. So with that, get your boosters and keep enjoying your favorite things.
Thank you for listening to Finding Favorites with Leah Jones. Please make sure to subscribe and drop us a 5-star review on iTunes. Now, go out and enjoy your favorite things.